Imagine, for a moment, that the American justice system holds more than 2 million people behind bars, a number so staggering it represents nearly a quarter of the world's entire prison population. It's a system built on laws, precedents, and the pursuit of order, but sometimes that pursuit takes a turn into the downright bizarre. Today, we're stepping into a world where justice isn't just served, it's sometimes sculpted into something utterly strange, something that defies expectation and occasionally defies belief. We're talking about 32 of the strangest prison sentences ever handed down in American history, punishments that go far beyond simple jail time and enter a realm of creative, confounding, and almost unbelievable legal decisions. These aren't your typical cases of years behind bars or standard fines. These are sentences that make you pause and wonder what was going through the judge's mind. From orders to watch specific films over and over, to being sentenced to hold a sign confessing one's crime in public, to punishments involving Shakespearean soliloquies or forced organ donations, the American legal system has at times reached for something different. Something unusual, something that makes you question not just the crime but the creativity, or perhaps the cruelty of the consequence. It's a fascinating window into how the law sometimes bends, twists, and even breaks its own mold in the name of justice, rehabilitation, or pure, old-fashioned deterrence. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare for a journey through some of the most peculiar legal outcomes in U.S. history. This is more than a list. It's an exploration of human nature, judicial imagination, and the moments when the courtroom felt more like theater than tradition. By the end, you'll not only have discovered stories you likely never knew existed, you'll see the justice system in a whole new light, one that is by turns shocking, amusing, and deeply, deeply strange. Let's begin. Our journey into the strange begins not in a maximum security prison, but in a movie theater or perhaps on a living room couch. In 2017, a man named Robert Corey in Kentucky found himself in a situation that sounds more like a surreal short story than a legal proceeding. He was a repeat offender, consistently appearing before the court for the same kind of low-level, alcohol-related offenses. He was stuck, quite literally, in a cycle of his own making. But the judge overseeing his case, the Honorable Michael Caperton, decided that typical punitive measures weren't working. Instead of another short stint in jail that would inevitably lead right back to his old habits, Judge Caperton handed down a sentence that made national headlines. He ordered Corey to watch the 1993 comedy classic Groundhog Day not once, but once a month for the entire duration of his 2-year probation. The brilliance of this sentence lies in its perfect, almost poetic alignment. For those who haven't seen it, Groundhog Day stars Bill Murray as Phil Connors, a cynical and self-centered weatherman who is forced to relive the same day over and over and over again in the small town of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Initially, he uses the time loop for selfish gain and personal pleasure, but he eventually falls into a deep despair, realizing his existence is utterly meaningless. The only way out is for him to fundamentally change who he is, to become a better person, to learn new skills to help others, and to genuinely connect with the community around him. Judge Caperton saw Robert Corey's life as a real-world version of that very time loop. He wasn't just sentencing a man to watch a movie, he was prescribing a form of narrative therapy. The judge's reasoning was that Corey needed a clear, accessible metaphor for his own self-destructive behavior. By watching Phil Connors' transformation from a miserable man trapped by his own flaws into a generous and beloved figure who earns his freedom, Corey might find a blueprint for his own escape. It was a sentence designed to inspire introspection, to force a defendant to see his own life from a new angle. The court wasn't just punishing a past action, it was attempting to engineer a future change, using the power of storytelling to break a cycle that the traditional system had failed to stop. While the Groundhog Day sentence aimed for rehabilitation through metaphor, another judge looked far back into history for inspiration, drawing from an ancient sense of poetic justice. This story takes us to Indiana, where a man was convicted of a deeply callous crime, animal cruelty. The details are grim. He had confined several chickens inside a sweltering, cramped shed in the middle of a heat wave, leaving them without adequate food, water, or ventilation. The birds suffered immensely, and several died as a direct result of his neglect. When the case came before the court, the judge saw that a simple fine or a short jail term felt insufficient. The punishment needed to fit the crime in a way that would truly resonate with the defendant. The sentence handed down was as unusual as it was symbolic. The man was ordered to spend 48 hours locked inside the very same chicken coop where he had caused so much suffering. This was a modern, judicial take on the concept of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, often summarized by the phrase, an eye for an eye. The philosophy behind this approach is to create a direct, visceral connection between the criminal act and its consequence, forcing the perpetrator to literally step into the shoes, or in this case, the feathers of their victim. The judge's intention was to engineer a moment of profound empathy, or at the very least, a stark understanding of the conditions he had imposed on helpless creatures. For 2 full days, the man experienced the stifling heat, the cramped quarters, and the isolation he had inflicted. It was a punishment designed not just to penalize, but to educate and shame, using the setting of the crime itself as the instrument of justice. This creative sentencing sparks a complex debate about the line between meaningful deterrence and unusual punishment, questioning whether such a direct, almost theatrical form of retribution truly serves the interests of justice or simply satisfies a public desire for poetic comeuppance. Moving from the scorching heat of a chicken coop to the timeless pages of English literature, we find another judge who believed that the path to redemption could be paved with iambic pentameter. This unusual case unfolded in Chicago, where a young man stood before Cook County Circuit Court Judge William H. Hooks. The teenager had been convicted of a robbery, a serious offense that typically carries the threat of significant jail time, especially for a repeat offender. But Judge Hooks saw something else in the defendant, not just a criminal to be punished, but a young person who had lost his way and was perhaps capable of more. Instead of a standard sentence of incarceration, the judge issued a mandate that was both unexpected and intellectually demanding. He ordered the young man to read 5 of William Shakespeare's greatest plays and then write detailed reports on each one, analyzing their themes and characters. This was far from a simple book report assignment. The selected plays were not random. Judge Hooks specifically chose works like Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and Hamlet tragedies steeped in profound explorations of power, ambition, morality, and the devastating consequences of poor choices. The judge's intention was to use these classic texts as a form of moral and emotional instruction. He wasn't just handing out homework, he was attempting to administer a crash course in empathy and critical thinking. By wrestling with the complex motivations of characters like Macbeth, whose vaulting ambition leads him to murder and tyranny, or Brutus, who commits a terrible act for what he believes is the good of Rome, the young defendant was forced to confront the nature of choice, consequence, and human frailty. The act of writing reports ensured he couldn't just skim the surface. He had to engage deeply with the material, to synthesize its lessons, and to reflect on them in his own words. Judge Hooks's sentence was a bold experiment in rehabilitative justice, rooted in the belief that exposure to great art and complex ideas can fundamentally reshape a person's perspective. It was a punishment that demanded intellectual labor and introspection instead of passive time served. The goal was to cultivate a broader understanding of the world and the human condition, hoping that by examining the tragic flaws of Shakespeare's characters, the young man might better recognize and correct the flaws in his own judgment. This approach challenges the very foundation of punitive justice, suggesting that for some offenders, the key to breaking a cycle of crime isn't found in a jail cell but in the expansion of one's mind and the cultivation of empathy through the power of story. It raises a compelling question: can reading Shakespeare truly make someone a better person? While the long-term effectiveness of such a sentence is difficult to measure, its creativity underscores a persistent hope within the justice system, that even those who have done wrong can be guided toward a better path through wisdom and enlightenment. This idea of forcing a direct confrontation with one's actions finds a powerful echo in a case from Pennsylvania, where the damage was not to animals or to one's own potential, but to something held sacred by an entire community. A young man was convicted of vandalizing a local cemetery, a deeply unsettling crime that involved toppling headstones, defacing monuments, and desecrating the final resting places of countless individuals. For the families connected to that ground, the vandalism was a profound violation, a second wave of grief crashing upon them as they saw the markers of their loved ones' memories treated with such contempt. A standard punishment might have involved community service, but the specific location felt too generic, too disconnected from the specific pain he had caused. The judge, seeking a more meaningful resolution, handed down a sentence that was both simple and deeply symbolic. The vandal was ordered to return to that same cemetery every weekend for an entire year to perform its maintenance and cleanup duties. This sentence is a textbook example of restorative justice, a philosophy that moves beyond simply punishing an offender to actively repairing the harm done to victims and the community. Instead of isolating the vandal in a jail cell, a punishment that does nothing to fix the broken headstones or heal the community's anger, the sentence forced him to engage directly with the consequences of his actions. His weekends would now be spent mowing the lawns around the graves he defaced, raking leaves over the plots he disturbed, and perhaps most powerfully, carefully cleaning and righting the very headstones he had knocked over. This hands-on labor was designed to be more than just free work. It was intended as a continuous, repetitive lesson in respect and consequence. The psychological impact of such a sentence is profound. Each weekend, the vandal would be surrounded by the evidence of his crime, confronted by the names and dates on the stones, and reminded that these were not anonymous slabs of granite but cherished memorials to real people. He would likely encounter grieving families visiting their loved ones, forcing him to see the human cost of what he might have dismissed as a mere prank. This approach aims to foster genuine remorse and empathy in a way a fine or jail time rarely can. It transforms the abstract concept of paying a debt to society into a tangible, physical act of repairing a specific wrong. The community, in turn, gets to see justice served not as a hidden transaction in a courtroom, but as a visible, ongoing process of healing and restoration, mending both the landscape and the social fabric he tore. Moving from the quiet, reflective labor of cemetery maintenance to the very public spectacle of a highway billboard, we encounter a sentence designed not just for restitution but for maximum humiliation. In Ohio, a business owner found himself on the wrong side of the law after being convicted of defrauding his customers through a series of deceptive and dishonest practices. His actions weren't just a minor breach of contract, they represented a calculated betrayal of trust that damaged the financial well-being of the people he had served. The judge in the case determined that a standard fine or probationary period wouldn't adequately address the specific nature of his crime, which thrived in the shadows of private transactions and broken promises. The sentence was as public as his crimes were private. The court ordered him to purchase space on a large billboard overlooking a major highway and use it to post a formal, written apology for his fraudulent actions, detailing exactly what he had done wrong. This form of punishment, known as a shaming sentence, has a long and complex history, but its application in modern white-collar cases is particularly fascinating. The goal is twofold. First, it acts as a uniquely powerful personal punishment for the offender. While a fine can be paid off and eventually forgotten, a massive public admission of guilt creates a lasting, visible scarlet letter. The business owner had to confront his shame every day, knowing that thousands of passing motorists were reading his confession and judging him for it. This psychological impact is often far more potent than a financial penalty for someone whose reputation is a core asset. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it serves as a stark deterrent to others in similar positions of trust. The billboard sends a clear message to the entire business community that fraudulent actions will not only lead to legal consequences but also to very public ruin. It transforms the offender from a private individual who made a mistake into a public cautionary tale, a living example of the price of deceit. The use of shaming sentences raises profound ethical questions about the role of the justice system. Is it the court's job to intentionally humiliate someone, even if they are guilty? Proponents argue that for non-violent crimes, particularly those involving a breach of public trust, shaming can be a highly effective and cost-efficient tool that avoids overcrowding prisons. It directly attacks the asset many white-collar criminals value most, their reputation, and offers a form of direct restitution to the community by publicly acknowledging the wrong. Critics, however, see it as a potentially cruel and unusual step backwards, a revival of the pillory and the stocks that can inflict disproportionate and lasting damage on an individual's life long after their sentence is officially complete. They argue it can hinder genuine rehabilitation by permanently branding someone, making it difficult for them to find employment and reintegrate into society. This tension between effective deterrence and human dignity sits at the very heart of this strange and compelling sentence, showing that sometimes the most memorable punishments are those that play out not in a cell but in the court of public opinion. From the realm of public shaming, we turn to a sentence that delved into the deeply personal, raising difficult questions about the intersection of criminal behavior, personal identity, and the limits of judicial power. In the early 1980s, a man named Dennis Gene Anderson made headlines not just for the crime he committed, but for his chosen disguise. Anderson was a bank robber who frequently donned a wig, makeup, and women's clothing to conceal his identity during heists. When he was finally apprehended and stood before a federal judge, the court was presented with a unique dilemma. The judge, perhaps perplexed by the method of the crimes or seeking a root cause for the criminal behavior, handed down a sentence that went far beyond prison time. As a condition of his probation, Dennis Anderson was ordered to undergo psychological counseling specifically targeted at his cross-dressing. This sentence, while perhaps well-intentioned from a rehabilitative standpoint, immediately plunges us into a thicket of modern ethical controversy. On its surface, the order for psychological treatment could be seen as an attempt to address a potential underlying issue the court believed was connected to the criminal acts. The judge might have reasoned that the cross-dressing was a symptom of a deeper psychological distress that was driving the defendant to commit robberies, and that treating this distress was key to preventing future crimes. However, the specific targeting of his cross-dressing behavior as the focus of treatment is deeply problematic. The sentence effectively pathologized his choice of disguise, equating it with the criminal act itself and implying that his gender expression was a disorder in need of correction. This approach is now widely criticized for conflating a personal identity issue, cross-dressing, with a separate, unlawful action, armed robbery. The man's criminal intent was to steal money. His choice of clothing was merely the method he used to achieve that goal. By ordering therapy to cure his cross-dressing, the court ventured into dangerous territory, suggesting that the way he expressed his gender was inherently linked to his criminality. This reflects a historical and outdated view that often unfairly associated queer and gender nonconforming identities with deviance and mental illness. A more contemporary and ethical approach would have been to mandate psychological counseling focused on the underlying issues that actually lead to criminal behavior, such as problems with impulse control, financial desperation, or a willingness to use violence, while leaving his personal expression entirely out of it. This strange sentence stands as a stark reminder of how the justice system can sometimes overstep, attempting to fix aspects of a person's life that are not broken, simply because they fall outside a judge's own understanding of normalcy. While the previous sentences explored creative punishments aimed at shame or introspection, another approach focuses on severing the very connection to the crime itself through strict behavior-based prohibition. This brings us to the peculiar case of a man from Wisconsin, a repeat offender for driving under the influence. His history showed a clear and dangerous pattern of alcohol abuse directly leading to criminal behavior, putting countless lives at risk every time he got behind the wheel. The court needed a sentence that went beyond a simple license suspension or a short jail stay. They needed to directly attack the root of the problem. The judge's ruling was therefore exceptionally precise and far-reaching. The man was prohibited from consuming any form of alcohol, a standard condition, but then the order went a critical step further. He was also explicitly banned from drinking non-alcoholic beer for the entire 3-year duration of his probation. On its surface, banning a product that contains no intoxicating substances might seem illogical, even overly punitive. But the psychological reasoning behind this part of the sentence is actually quite sophisticated and reveals a deep understanding of addiction and behavioral triggers. For someone with a severe alcohol dependency, the rituals and sensory experiences associated with drinking can be just as powerful as the chemical effects of the alcohol itself. The act of holding a cold bottle, the specific sound of a can opening, the familiar taste of hops and barley, these are all deeply ingrained cues that can trigger powerful cravings and reignite the habitual cycle of drinking. Non-alcoholic beer, while free of ethanol, perfectly replicates every single one of these sensory triggers. Allowing it would be like giving a recovering opioid addict a placebo pill that looks and feels identical to their drug of choice. It keeps the ritual alive and actively works against the goal of breaking the addiction. The judge's order was designed to facilitate a complete behavioral reset. By eliminating even the imitation of the act, the sentence forced the offender to disassociate from every aspect of his drinking routine. It wasn't just about keeping him sober in the moment, it was about rewiring his habits and dismantling the automatic patterns that led him to relapse. This approach is supported by addiction science, which shows that avoiding all people, places, and things associated with substance use is a cornerstone of successful recovery. The ban on non-alcoholic beer was a judicial acknowledgement of this principle, creating a clear and enforceable boundary to protect the offender from himself. It was a sentence that looked beyond the letter of the law, which typically only concerns itself with intoxication, and into the mind of the addict, aiming to build a moat around his behavior where a simple line in the sand had repeatedly failed. In a similar vein of crafting consequences to directly address the harm caused, a deeply resonant sentence emerged from a case involving animal neglect. Here, the offender wasn't a large-scale operation, but an individual whose failure to provide basic care resulted in the suffering of pets under her watch. The details were heartbreaking. Emaciated animals living in filth, denied not just affection but the most fundamental necessities of life. A jail sentence, while punishing, would do nothing to educate the woman or prevent her from repeating the behavior upon release. It also did nothing to help the countless other animals in need. The judge's solution was a masterclass in targeted rehabilitation. The woman was ordered to complete a significant number of volunteer hours at a local animal shelter and to undergo professional psychological counseling. This sentence operates on multiple levels of restorative justice. First, the volunteer work directly benefits the community that was wronged, in this case, the broader world of animal welfare. Instead of sitting idle in a cell, her labor is transformed into a positive force, cleaning kennels, preparing food, and providing comfort to animals who desperately need it. This act of service is designed to be a continuous, hands-on lesson in proper animal care, forcing her to learn and perform the very duties she had neglected. She is surrounded by professionals and volunteers who model compassion and responsibility, creating an immersive environment for behavioral change. Second, and perhaps more crucially, the mandate for counseling acknowledges that animal neglect is often a symptom of a deeper issue, such as hoarding disorder, severe depression, or a profound lack of empathy and education. The court recognized that punishment alone would not solve these underlying problems. By ordering professional evaluation and therapy, the sentence aimed to uncover and address the root cause of the neglect, whether it was a mental health crisis, overwhelming life circumstances, or a simple but profound ignorance of an animal's needs. This therapeutic component shifts the focus from pure retribution to genuine rehabilitation, providing the tools and self-awareness necessary for lasting change. The goal was not just to ensure she would never neglect an animal again, but to help her understand why she did it in the first place and to heal that part of herself. This approach demonstrates a nuanced understanding that some crimes stem from brokenness rather than pure malice, and that the most effective justice sometimes involves healing rather than just hurting. This push towards a more visceral, physical form of punishment reached its most extreme and controversial expression in a 1994 Alabama courtroom, where a judge's sentence seemed to leap directly from the pages of an 18th century legal ledger. The case involved a man named Grady Dudley, who had been convicted of a series of thefts. In a move that shocked the nation, Circuit Court Judge Marion County ordered that as part of his sentence, Dudley was to be taken to the town square and subjected to a public flogging. Specifically, he was to be struck 30 times with a leather strap. The image it conjured was one of pure colonial-era justice. A crowd gathered, the offender tied to a whipping post, and the state-sanctioned application of corporal punishment for all to see. The sentence immediately ignited a firestorm of legal and ethical debate, centering on the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which explicitly prohibits the infliction of cruel and unusual punishments. Public flogging, a practice abandoned by most states by the mid-19th century, is the very definition of what the framers sought to eliminate from the American justice system. Legal scholars and civil liberties organizations were swift to condemn Judge County's order, arguing that it was a barbaric and degrading throwback that had no place in a modern society. The punishment was seen as inherently cruel due to the intentional infliction of physical pain, and unusual because its method had been obsolete for over a century, making it a clear violation of contemporary standards of decency. But why would a modern judge even consider such a sentence? Judge County's reasoning, echoed by a small minority of proponents, was rooted in a profound frustration with the perceived failures of the contemporary system. He argued that short jail terms and probation were ineffective revolving doors for non-violent offenders like Dudley, failing to provide a meaningful deterrent or any lasting rehabilitation. In his view, a brief, sharp, and memorably painful physical punishment would be a more effective way to shock an offender onto a straight path and send an unequivocal message to the community than a forgettable stint in an overcrowded jail. This perspective frames corporal punishment not as cruelty for its own sake, but as a utilitarian alternative, a short, severe jolt intended to prevent a lifetime of crime. Despite the judge's intentions, the sentence was never carried out. Higher courts would have inevitably overturned it, as the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently ruled that punishments must align with the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Public flogging fails this test spectacularly. Furthermore, the implementation of such a sentence would present insurmountable practical and ethical nightmares who would administer the blows. What medical personnel would be present to oversee state-sanctioned injury? the sentence stood as a powerful, albeit unenforceable, statement of judicial frustration rather than a viable legal outcome. It serves as a stark boundary marker in American jurisprudence, a reminder that while judges may sometimes yearn for the simplistic severity of the past, the Constitution firmly anchors the justice system to a principle of humane treatment, however imperfectly applied. Long before the widespread adoption of ankle monitors and sophisticated GPS tracking, a judge in the 1970s devised a remarkably simple yet effective form of confinement that would become a precursor to modern home detention programs. The case involved a non-violent offender whose crimes, while not severe enough to warrant a costly prison sentence, still demanded a meaningful consequence. The judge's innovative solution was to sentence the man to a full year of what was essentially a strict, self-enforced quarantine. He was ordered to remain within his own home at all times, with permission to leave only for his job and for absolutely essential activities like purchasing groceries or seeking medical care. There were no electronic devices to monitor his movements, no probation officer conducting random drive-bys. The entire system was built on the honor system and the very real threat of a much harsher penalty if he violated the court's trust. This sentence was revolutionary for its time because it represented a fundamental rethinking of the purpose of incarceration. Instead of viewing punishment as a binary choice between freedom and a jail cell, the judge introduced a third option: the restriction of liberty without the destructive side effects of imprisonment. By allowing the man to keep his job, the sentence avoided crippling his family financially and prevented him from becoming a burden on the state. It allowed him to maintain his family relationships and his role in the community, which are often the first casualties of a traditional jail term. The punishment was the profound isolation and the radical limitation of his freedom, the inability to go to a restaurant, see a movie, or socialize with friends. Every weekend spent watching the world go by from his window was a continuous reminder of his transgression and the conditional nature of his freedom. This early experiment in home confinement highlights the pragmatic roots of what would evolve into today's electronic monitoring programs. It acknowledged that for certain non-violent offenders, the collateral damage of prison, loss of employment, disruption of family stability, exposure to more hardened criminals could be more damaging to society in the long run than the original crime. The judge's creativity laid the groundwork for a more nuanced approach to justice, one that seeks to punish and rehabilitate simultaneously by integrating offenders into the community under strict constraints rather than completely cutting them off from it. This case stands as a testament to judicial ingenuity, proving that sometimes the most effective sentence isn't about building more walls, but about drawing a very firm, very clear line around one's own home. This creative approach to justice took a turn into deeply contested constitutional territory with a sentence that directly engaged with matters of faith. In 2012, an Oklahoma judge presiding over a case of deadly driving found himself searching for a sentence that offered more than just punishment. The defendant had caused a fatal accident while under the influence of drugs, a tragedy that left a family shattered and a community in mourning. The judge's ruling was as unconventional as it was provocative. As a condition of his 10-year deferred sentence, the young man was ordered to attend church every single Sunday for the same duration. This mandate wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a legally binding requirement, with the threat of prison looming if he failed to faithfully show up at a place of worship. The intention behind the sentence was likely rooted in a desire for moral and spiritual rehabilitation. The judge perhaps believed that regular exposure to a religious community and its teachings could instill a stronger ethical compass in the defendant, guiding him toward a more responsible and reflective life. In the judge's view, the church could offer a support system and a framework for atonement that the secular justice system, with its focus on penalties and restrictions, could not provide on its own. It was an attempt to heal the soul of the offender in the hope of preventing future harm. However, this well-intentioned order immediately collided with one of the most fundamental principles of American law, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which mandates the separation of church and state. Legal experts and civil liberties organizations were swift to voice their alarm. The core problem was that a state actor, a judge, was effectively coercing a citizen into participating in religious exercise. The government was not just endorsing religion in general, it was making religious observance a compulsory component of a criminal sentence. This created a situation where the power of the state was being used to enforce church attendance, a concept that seems directly imported from a theocracy rather than a constitutional republic. The legal challenges were inevitable and fierce. Critics argued that the sentence violated the defendant's own rights, potentially forcing him to profess beliefs he did not hold, which is a form of coercion utterly antithetical to the principle of religious freedom. Furthermore, it implicitly sent a message to non-Christian citizens that their own forms of worship or secular ethical frameworks were less valued by the court, creating an official preference for one type of belief system. The sentence was eventually overturned on appeal, with a higher court recognizing the profound constitutional overstep. This case serves as a stark reminder of the rigid but necessary boundaries that exist within the judicial system. While a judge may sincerely believe that faith can reform a person, the state's power must stop at the church door, ensuring that redemption, however it is found, remains a matter of personal choice, not a court order. While the concept of home confinement reimagined the physical space of punishment, another sentence delved into the most intimate of human interactions, imposing a court order not on where a person could go, but on how they could express affection. This unusual case involved a man convicted of sexual harassment after he repeatedly made unwelcome physical advances, specifically forcing kisses on a woman without her consent. The behavior was a clear violation, a predatory act that used a gesture of intimacy as a weapon of power and control. The judge, seeking a sentence that would directly prevent a recurrence of this specific misconduct, issued a restraining order with a condition that was as precise as it was unprecedented. For a period of 2 years, the man was legally prohibited from kissing anyone without first obtaining their express verbal permission. This sentence is fascinating because it operates on two distinct levels. On its surface, it functions as a highly specific behavioral injunction. It doesn't just tell the man to be a better person. It gives him a concrete, non-negotiable rule to follow. You must ask and you must receive a clear yes before you initiate this specific act. This transforms the abstract concept of consent into a mandatory, verbal transaction for him, creating a legal safeguard for potential future victims. The punishment for violating this order would be immediate and severe, likely resulting in jail time, which provides a powerful deterrent against repeating his past behavior. But on a deeper psychological level, the sentence is a form of forced re-education. The judge's order essentially mandated a crash course in empathy and respect. By legally requiring the man to verbalize his request for consent, the court was forcing him to acknowledge the autonomy and agency of the other person in a way he had clearly never done before. Every time he might be inclined to kiss someone, he is compelled to pause, to break his own predatory momentum, and to engage in a moment of communication. This pause is where respect is born. It forces him to see his potential partner not as an object for his own gratification, but as a human being with a right to choose. The sentence aimed to rewire his understanding of physical intimacy, replacing a pattern of taking with a practice of asking. It's a stark example of the justice system attempting to legislate basic human decency, using the threat of punishment to teach a lesson that should be fundamental to all social interaction. Turning from the intimate sphere of consent to the very public world of fast food, we encounter a sentence that viewed flipping burgers not as a dead-end job, but as a gateway to character building. This story takes us to a courtroom where a young man stood accused of a series of non-violent, petty crimes, likely stemming from a lack of direction and discipline rather than any hardened criminal intent. The judge faced a familiar dilemma. Sentencing yet another young person to a short stint in county jail would likely do little more than expose him to more negative influences and add a criminal record to his already slim resume. Instead, the judge handed down a sentence that was both pragmatic and profoundly instructive. The young man was ordered to secure a job at a McDonald's restaurant and to maintain that employment for a specified period as a condition of his probation. The reasoning behind this unusual mandate was deeply rooted in a belief in the rehabilitative power of routine, responsibility, and humble work. The judge wasn't merely finding a punishment. He was attempting to administer an antidote to the idleness and lack of structure that often feeds youthful delinquency. A job at a busy fast food chain like McDonald's is a crash course in accountability. It requires showing up on time, following detailed instructions, working as part of a team under pressure, and dealing directly with the public, all under the watchful eye of a manager who demands performance. This environment, often dismissed as menial labor, forces the development of soft skills that are critical for long-term success: patience, time management, customer service, and the simple ability to complete a task. The judge's theory was that these lessons in personal responsibility and the dignity of earning a paycheck would be far more valuable and lasting than the lessons learned in a jail cell. This sentence also cleverly addressed the economic factors that can contribute to criminal behavior. By mandating employment, the court was ensuring the young man had a legitimate source of income, removing a potential motive for future theft or fraud. Furthermore, it provided him with something arguably more valuable than the money itself: a work history and a professional reference. For someone with a criminal record, finding that first job can be nearly impossible, creating a vicious cycle where unemployment leads back to crime. The judge's order effectively broke that cycle by force, giving the young man a foothold in the legitimate economy and a chance to build a resume that could eventually include something other than his offense. It was a sentence that looked beyond retribution toward reintegration, using the demanding, unglamorous world of the service industry as a classroom for citizenship. Our exploration of creative justice now leaps firmly into the 21st century, where a judge in California confronted a crime born entirely from the digital age. The defendant was a social media influencer, a person whose personal brand and livelihood were built upon a constant stream of curated online content. Her offense was a reckless and illegal stunt performed solely for the purpose of generating viral clicks and views, an act that demonstrated a blatant disregard for both safety and the law in the pursuit of online notoriety. Recognizing that a traditional fine or brief probation would be little more than a cost of doing business for someone in her position, the judge crafted a sentence aimed directly at the root of the problem. As a strict condition of her probation, the influencer was completely banned from taking any selfies and was prohibited from posting any content to her social media accounts for a specified period. This sentence represents a fascinating and necessary evolution of judicial thinking, acknowledging that for certain modern offenders, the most valued currency isn't money, it's attention. The punishment was a form of digital deprivation, a forced disconnect from the very platform that had incentivized the criminal behavior in the first place. For an influencer, being barred from social media is akin to a chef being banned from the kitchen or a driver losing their license. It is a targeted incapacitation that strikes at the core of their identity and livelihood. The sentence was designed to inflict a tangible consequence where it would be felt most acutely: the loss of followers, the decline of engagement, and the fading of online relevance. It forced a period of reflection away from the dopamine-driven feedback loop of likes and comments, creating space for the defendant to contemplate the real-world consequences of her digital era actions. Beyond mere punishment, this probation condition also functioned as a vital public safety measure. By removing her ability to broadcast her life, the court effectively neutralized her platform as a tool for encouraging further reckless imitation. It sent a powerful deterrent message to her entire audience and the influencer community at large. Using illegal acts as content will not be tolerated and will result in the loss of the very thing you crave. This case highlights the growing challenge courts face in applying centuries-old legal principles to behaviors amplified by modern technology. It proves that justice must now consider digital personas, online economies, and the powerful motivational force of social clout, crafting sentences that are not only punitive but also prophylactic, designed to protect the public from the next dangerous trend conceived for the sake of going viral. This concept of tying the punishment directly to the nature of the offense finds a powerful and pungent example in a case of youthful vandalism. A group of teenagers, likely seeking a thrill or acting out of sheer boredom, broke into a local horse stable. Their mischief wasn't harmless. They caused significant property damage and, more importantly, created a terrifying and unsafe environment for the animals housed inside. When they stood before the judge, the court faced a choice: a standard penalty of fines their parents would pay or a generic community service assignment picking up trash in a park. Instead, the judge crafted a sentence that was both brilliantly fitting and deeply instructive. The teenagers were ordered to report to that very same stable every single weekend for 6 months, not as visitors but as workers tasked with the messy, demanding job of mucking out the stalls. This sentence is a masterclass in restorative justice, designed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. First and foremost, it provided tangible, hands-on restitution to the business owner who had been wronged. Instead of the abstract notion of paying a debt to society, their labor directly repaired the damage they had caused, saving the stable owner the cost of hiring someone for a difficult job. But the true genius of the punishment lay in its psychological and educational impact. For these teenagers, cleaning the stables was far more than just free labor. It was a continuous, immersive lesson in consequence and responsibility. Every Saturday morning, as they shoveled manure, hauled soiled hay, and scrubbed water buckets, they were surrounded by the direct results of their actions. The physical exertion, the less than glamorous aroma, and the sheer monotony of the task served as a constant, visceral reminder of the thoughtless crime they had committed. The sentence also forced a crucial shift in perspective. Their vandalism had treated the stable as an impersonal target, a mere structure. By working there week after week, they were inevitably exposed to the animals they had frightened and the people whose livelihood depended on the stable's operation. They would have to interact with the horses, understanding them as sensitive creatures rather than props, and perhaps even work alongside the owner, seeing the dedication required to maintain such a business. This environment was crafted to foster a sense of empathy and respect that was clearly absent before. The judge's order understood that true correction often comes not from mere punishment, but from being compelled to engage directly with the very thing one has thoughtlessly defaced, transforming a site of transgression into a classroom for character. This idea of a punishment designed to reshape one's fundamental perspective finds perhaps its most symbolic expression in a case involving a hunter who had consistently violated wildlife protection laws. The man was a repeat offender, convicted of poaching animals that were either out of season or protected species altogether. His actions demonstrated a clear disregard for conservation efforts and the ethical principles of fair chase, viewing wildlife not as a shared natural resource to be managed responsibly, but as personal property to be taken at will. A standard fine or a brief suspension of his hunting license had proven to be utterly ineffective. These were mere slaps on the wrist that he simply paid or waited out before returning to his old habits. The presiding judge, searching for a sentence that would actually force a moment of profound self-reflection, issued a ruling that was as unconventional as it was philosophically nuanced, As a condition of his probation, the poacher was ordered to adopt a strict vegetarian diet for an entire year. On its surface, this mandate might seem like a bizarre and almost whimsical judicial whim, but its intended purpose was deeply rehabilitative and powerfully symbolic. The sentence was not merely a dietary restriction, it was a court-ordered exercise in empathy and consequence. The judge's reasoning was that this man, through his illegal hunting, had shown a fundamental failure to connect the act of killing with the reality of consuming meat. By forcing him to completely abstain from all meat products, the court was compelling him to literally embody the consequence of his own actions. If he could not hunt lawfully, then he would not partake in the fruits of hunting at all. Every meal became a deliberate choice and a reminder of his transgression. A simple cheeseburger or a piece of grilled chicken was no longer an unconscious act of consumption but a forbidden temptation, a constant, low-level reminder of the privileges he had lost through his own illegal behavior. This approach operates on a principle of forced alignment between action and values. The poacher likely saw himself as a hunter, a consumer of meat, a person who lived off the land. The sentence forced a stark contradiction within that identity. You cannot be a lawful consumer of meat if you are an unlawful taker of life. The year of vegetarianism was intended to be a prolonged period for this contradiction to settle in his mind, hopefully fostering a new respect for the animals he had once treated so carelessly. It aimed to break his automatic entitlement to wildlife and replace it with a more mindful relationship with the food he ate. The punishment was cleverly tailored to the crime, targeting not just the defendant's behavior but his underlying mindset. It was the judicial system's attempt to use a dinner plate as a canvas for painting a lesson in ethics, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of all living things, challenging the offender to finally understand that the creatures he hunted were not just targets, but sentient beings that ended up as the very sustenance he was now legally barred from enjoying. Perhaps one of the most creatively psychological sentences ever devised took the stage in a New York courtroom, where a man's threatening and aggressively hostile comments landed him in legal trouble. Instead of a standard punishment that might have only fueled his resentment, the judge ordered an unconventional form of rehabilitation. The man was sentenced to write and perform a 5-minute stand-up comedy routine about his own crime and the circumstances that led to it. This wasn't meant to be a simple apology. It was a court-mandated journey into the spotlight, requiring him to mind his own bad behavior for laughs in front of a live audience. The underlying theory was as brilliant as it was counterintuitive. By forcing him to reframe his anger and threats through the lens of humor, the court aimed to fundamentally dismantle the power those destructive impulses held over him. This approach is deeply rooted in psychological principles, particularly the concept of cognitive reframing. When we are caught in a cycle of anger or hostility, our perspective becomes rigid and narrow. We see our own grievances as completely justified and monumental. The act of creating comedy, however, demands the opposite mindset. To make something funny, you must step outside of yourself and adopt a more observational, ironic point of view. You have to identify the absurdity in a situation, including your own role in it. For this defendant, writing jokes about his crime necessitated that he stop taking himself so seriously and begin to see his own actions as perhaps foolish, disproportionate, or pathetically insecure. The process of scripting the routine forced him to deconstruct his moment of fury into a setup and a punchline, effectively transforming a source of personal power into an object of public amusement. This psychological alchemy, turning the lead of his aggression into the gold of comedy, was designed to rob those destructive impulses of their potency. Furthermore, the performance aspect of the sentence added a crucial layer of social feedback that a jail term could never provide. Standing on a stage and revealing his own folly to a room full of strangers required immense vulnerability. The audience's laughter, if he succeeded, wouldn't be a validation of his threats but a ratification of the court's perspective. that his behavior was at its core laughable. This experience can be incredibly powerful for someone whose actions are often driven by a desire to be seen as intimidating or powerful. Being laughed at in a controlled, constructive way can be a far more effective deterrent than being locked away, as it directly attacks the fragile ego that likely fueled the behavior in the first place. The sentence cleverly used the spotlight not to shame him, but to heal him, leveraging the connective, disarming power of humor to guide a troubled individual toward a healthier and perhaps even happier understanding of himself. Moving from the stage to the quiet solitude of a library, we find a sentence that believed the best remedy for a crime against literature was quite literally more literature. This case involved a serial book thief, an individual whose crimes were not acts of violence or desperation, but rather a peculiar assault on knowledge itself. He had been systematically stealing rare and valuable volumes from libraries and bookstores, not for financial gain it seemed, but for a twisted form of personal acquisition. When he was finally caught, the court was presented with a unique offender, a person whose criminality was intellectually motivated, a violation of trust that targeted society's repositories of learning. The judge, recognizing that a standard punishment would do little to address the root of this behavior, crafted a sentence as nuanced as the crime itself. The thief was ordered to read a carefully curated list of books, specific titles focused entirely on themes of morality, ethics, and the philosophical concepts of right and wrong, and then to compose detailed written reports on each one. This sentence represents a pinnacle of the rehabilitative ideal, an approach that views the justice system not just as a punisher but as an educator. The judge's selection of texts was deliberate and insightful. He didn't assign random classics, he chose works that would serve as a direct counter-argument to the defendant's own actions. Imagine being forced to read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which painstakingly defines the concept of virtue and the importance of moral character. Or perhaps Immanuel Kant's groundwork on the categorical imperative, which argues that one should only act according to principles that could become universal law. Each assigned book was a structured, centuries-old lecture on the very principles the defendant had ignored. The act of reading them was meant to be a form of intellectual immersion therapy, surrounding the thief with the very wisdom he had treated with such disrespect. The critical component, however, was the writing assignment. It's one thing to passively read a text, it's another entirely to actively engage with it, to synthesize its ideas and to articulate them in your own words. The judge understood this distinction. By mandating written reports, the court was ensuring the defendant couldn't simply skim the pages. He had to process the arguments, internalize the lessons on justice, fairness, and communal trust, and then demonstrate his comprehension on paper. This process forces a cognitive reckoning. To write a report on the importance of ethical conduct, he first had to understand it, and in understanding it, he would be compelled to contrast it with his own unethical behavior. The sentence cleverly used the thief's own intellect, the very tool he used to rationalize his crimes, as the instrument of his reform. It was a punishment designed to provoke an internal moral dialogue, hoping that by filling his mind with the great thoughts on ethics, there would be less room for the selfish justifications that led him to steal in the first place. This case stands as a powerful testament to the belief that for crimes of the mind, the most fitting sentence might just be a mandatory education of the conscience. This concept of using public platforms for atonement extends beyond the highway billboard into the very pages of local journalism, where one judge turned the court of public opinion into a formal venue for justice. In a case involving a businessman who had orchestrated a complex fraud, swindling investors and clients out of substantial sums of money, the presiding judge sought a punishment that would match the public nature of the trust he had violated. His sentence was both simple and severe. The man was ordered to purchase a full-page advertisement in the city's most widely circulated newspaper. But this was no promotional spot for his business. The ad space was to be used for a detailed, written confession of his crimes, listing the specific fraudulent schemes he had employed, and containing a direct, unambiguous apology to every one of his victims by name. This sentence masterfully serves a dual purpose, functioning as both a sharp punitive measure and a potential tool for restoration. As punishment, it weaponizes the offender's own reputation and ego. For a white-collar criminal who likely prized his public image and standing in the business community, being forced to permanently etch his guilt into the public record was a form of profound humiliation. There is no taking it back. The admission is there for colleagues, family, and future associates to see, creating a lasting public record of his misdeeds that a private court document could never achieve. It is a financial penalty, costing the price of the ad, but more significantly, it is a social and professional penalty, damaging his credibility and standing in a way that is far more personal than a fine paid to the state. Yet, the sentence also reaches for a restorative goal, aiming to provide a measure of justice for the victims that the traditional system often overlooks. In many fraud cases, victims are left not only financially harmed but also psychologically wounded, grappling with feelings of shame, foolishness, and a deep sense of violation. A private apology in a courtroom might acknowledge the legal wrong, but a public one in the newspaper validates their experience on a community-wide scale. It tells the victims and everyone who knows them that they were wronged by a criminal, not merely unlucky in a bad investment. This public vindication can be a crucial step in their healing process, restoring a sense of dignity and truth that the fraud itself had stolen. The ad also serves a vital public service function, warning others in the community about the specific tactics used by the fraudster, potentially preventing future crimes. This unique sentence demonstrates how the justice system can sometimes creatively leverage public exposure not just to punish, but to heal wounds, affirm truth, and strengthen the community's defenses against those who would exploit its trust. But of course, the justice system doesn't always look to classic literature or ancient philosophy for inspiration. Sometimes it sets its sights on the most modern of pastimes. In a case that resonated with a younger generation, a teenager stood before a judge after being convicted of a series of thefts. The details suggested the crimes were not born of desperate need, but of opportunity and perhaps a lack of constructive engagement. The judge learned that the young man spent an inordinate amount of his free time immersed in video games, often to the exclusion of other activities. Seeing a potential link between this sedentary, isolated hobby and the defendant's poor decision-making, the court issued a probation condition that was immediately relatable to millions. The teenager was completely banned from playing any video games for a full year. This sentence represents a fascinating and modern interpretation of a classic judicial tactic, the restriction of privileges. For generations, judges have ordered curfews, limited driving privileges, or banned contact with certain individuals. In this case, the court simply identified what it perceived as the defendant's most valued privilege, unrestricted access to digital entertainment, and revoked it. The underlying theory is behavioral. By removing a highly stimulating, rewarding, and potentially addictive leisure activity, the court forces a vacuum in the offender's daily life. The hours once filled with gaming now yawn open, creating an opportunity, or perhaps a necessity, for the defendant to seek out alternative forms of engagement. The hope is that he might fill this void with more positive pursuits, perhaps getting a part-time job, spending more time with family, engaging in physical activity, or simply developing the ability to be bored and find his own way out of it, a crucial life skill that constant digital stimulation can often circumvent. However, this approach also sparks a significant debate about causation and judicial overreach. The sentence implicitly makes a judgment that video games were a contributing factor to the criminal behavior, a connection that is far from scientifically proven. While excessive gaming can certainly correlate with social isolation or a disconnection from real-world consequences, it is rarely the sole cause of criminality. The danger is that the court might be mistaking a symptom for the disease, punishing a hobby rather than addressing the root causes of the theft, which could range from peer pressure and a need for acceptance to underlying economic pressures or a lack of parental guidance. Critics might argue that the sentence, while well-intentioned, is a simplistic solution to a complex problem, one that risks alienating the young defendant further by criminalizing a central part of his identity without providing clear, supported pathways to more constructive alternatives. It raises a profound question about the role of the judiciary. Should a court be in the business of prescribing how a person spends their leisure time, especially when the link between that activity and the crime is largely assumed rather than proven? This case shows the legal system grappling with modern culture, attempting to use its traditional tools to regulate a new digital landscape, and in doing so, entering a contentious debate about the very nature of play, responsibility, and the causes of crime. This concept of a journey as a form of penance found its most literal and physically demanding expression in a sentence that seems to belong to another era entirely. In the early 1980s, a young man in his 20s named Stephen Roy Kessler found himself standing before a judge in St. Louis, Missouri. His crime was a tragic one. He had been driving under the influence when he caused a car accident that resulted in the death of a close friend. The guilt and grief were overwhelming, and the court was faced with a profound challenge. How does one effectively sentence a defendant who is already serving a life term of his own remorse? The judge, Circuit Court Judge Brendan Ryan, determined that a traditional prison sentence would serve no one. Instead, he handed down a ruling that was as unconventional as it was monumental. He sentenced Stephen Kessler to walk across the entire United States, from the East Coast to the West Coast, as a form of probation. This was not a mere suggestion or a symbolic gesture. It was a legally binding condition of a 5-year probation term. Kessler was ordered to walk continuously for 18 months, covering a minimum of 15 miles every single day, rain or shine. He was to keep a detailed log of his progress, have it signed by local law enforcement in each town he passed through, and regularly mail these reports back to the court as proof of his compliance. Failure to maintain this grueling pace or to provide verification would mean violating his probation and facing immediate imprisonment. The sentence was designed to be isolating, physically arduous, and relentlessly introspective, a moving prison without walls. The judge's intention was to create the conditions for a profound spiritual and emotional reckoning. He believed that the monotonous, rhythmic act of walking for thousands of miles would provide a unique form of therapy, forcing Kessler to literally walk off his guilt and grief. There would be no distractions, no easy escapes from his thoughts. Each step was meant to be a meditation on the life he had taken, the pain he had caused, and the man he needed to become. The journey itself was the punishment, the rehabilitation, and the restitution, all rolled into one. It was a sentence that valued transformation over retribution, trusting that the raw experience of the road, the exhaustion, the solitude, the encounters with strangers, the sheer vastness of the country, would forge a deeper and more lasting change than any cell ever could. Kessler embraced the sentence not as a punishment to be endured, but as a pilgrimage to be completed, a way to honor his lost friend and somehow find a path to redemption, one step at a time. This jarring sentence brings us full circle to a concept we glimpsed earlier, but executed here with even starker and more controversial clarity. While the Indiana man sentenced to the chicken coop faced a powerful symbolic punishment, a judge in another jurisdiction took the principle of role reversal to its absolute logical extreme. A man was convicted of a particularly heinous act of animal cruelty, having left his own dog trapped inside a small, filthy outdoor kennel for weeks on end without adequate food, water, or shelter, leading to the animal's terrible suffering. The presiding judge, viewing a standard fine or short jail term as woefully insufficient for the severity of the neglect, crafted a sentence designed to be unforgettable. She ordered the man to be confined himself for 48 continuous hours inside an identical dog kennel, exposed to the very same elements and cramped conditions he had forced upon his pet. This punishment is perhaps the purest modern interpretation of lex talionis, the ancient law of retaliation, best known as an eye for an eye. The judge's intention was to create a direct, visceral, and inescapable experiential link between the criminal act and its consequence. It moves beyond mere symbolism into the realm of literal reenactment, forcing the offender to not just see but to physically endure the reality of the suffering he caused. Proponents of such a sentence argue that for a crime rooted in a profound lack of empathy, the most effective corrective is to engineer a moment of forced empathy, however brutal the method. The theory is that by subjecting the man to the heat, the confinement, the hunger, and the helplessness of his victim's existence, the court might finally shatter his indifference and brand the lesson onto his consciousness in a way a lecture or a fine never could. It is a punishment aimed not just at the mind, but at the body, using physical discomfort as a teaching tool to convey the value of a life he had treated as worthless. However, this approach ignites a fiery debate about the limits of judicial power and the very definition of cruelty. Critics vehemently argue that such a sentence, however poetic it may seem, dangerously blurs the line between justice and vengeance, potentially violating the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They contend that the state must hold itself to a higher standard than the criminal it condemns, that by mirroring the act of cruelty, even as a punishment, the court risks degrading its own moral authority and legitimizing barbaric treatment. There is also a profound practical question about its long-term effectiveness. Does such a traumatic experience genuinely foster a lasting respect for animal life, or does it merely breed resentment, humiliation, and a deeper well of anger that might manifest in other, less detectable ways? This case forces us to confront a difficult question about the purpose of our justice system. Is its highest goal to inflict a proportionate harm, or to elevate society through methods that affirm human dignity, even for those who have failed to show it to others? The dog kennel sentence stands as a stark, uncomfortable boundary marker in this ongoing philosophical struggle, a real-world experiment in whether an eye for an eye ultimately makes the whole world blind, or if it sometimes offers the only way to make a cruel person finally see. This approach of mending broken connections to the past through mandated education found powerful expression in a case where the crime wasn't just against property, but against history itself. A man was convicted of defacing a series of historical monuments and statues, spray painting graffiti, and causing damage to stonework that had stood for over a century. These weren't random acts of vandalism. They were a targeted assault on public memorials, erasing names and scarring the likenesses of individuals celebrated for their contributions to the community's heritage. The judge, confronted with a defendant who had shown a blatant disregard for this cultural legacy, determined that a simple fine or cleanup detail would be insufficient. The sentence needed to address the root of the problem, a profound ignorance of or contempt for the very history he had marred. The court's ruling was as intellectually demanding as it was symbolic. The vandal was ordered to enroll in a full semester of local history classes at a community college and to compose a series of detailed research essays on the lives and accomplishments of the specific historical figures whose monuments he had damaged. This sentence elevates the concept of restorative justice from the physical to the intellectual and moral realm. While cleaning graffiti might repair the stone, it does nothing to repair the vandal's understanding or the community's sense of violated memory. By mandating formal education, the judge was attempting to rebuild that connection from the inside out. The history classes weren't meant as a mundane chore. They were a court-ordered journey into the narrative of the community itself. The defendant would be forced to sit in a classroom and learn about the events, struggles, and people that shaped the town he lived in, transforming the anonymous stone figures he defaced back into living, breathing human beings with stories worth preserving. This immersive educational experience was designed to replace his destructive impulse with a foundational respect, built on knowledge rather than ignorance. The critical component, however, was the research assignment. This wasn't passive learning, it was active, deep engagement. To write a meaningful essay on a historical figure, the defendant had to delve into archives, read biographies, and synthesize complex information about their life, work, and legacy. He had to confront the reasons why a community would collectively decide to honor this person, spending significant resources to erect a lasting tribute. This process forces a cognitive shift. It becomes much harder to mindlessly paint the name of someone whose life story you have painstakingly researched and documented. The sentence cleverly used the vandal's own intellect and effort as the mechanism for his reform, betting that by compelling him to invest his time and mental energy in understanding these figures, he would develop a personal stake in their preservation. This case stands as a powerful example of the justice system acting not merely as a punisher, but as a pedagogue, using the tools of education to combat cultural delinquency and hoping to transform a destroyer of history into a student of it. This rehabilitative philosophy extends powerfully into the most fundamental unit of society, the family, where the stakes of punishment are immeasurably high. In courtrooms across the country, judges presiding over cases of child neglect face a uniquely delicate dilemma. The crime itself is one of omission and failure, often stemming not from malicious intent but from a devastating cycle of poverty, lack of education, untreated mental health issues, or simply being overwhelmed and not knowing what to do. Sentencing a parent to jail for neglecting their children often inflicts a double punishment, traumatizing the very children the state is trying to protect by severing the parental bond and placing them into the foster care system. Recognizing this counterproductive dynamic, many judges have turned to a more nuanced sentence. Instead of incarceration, they order parents convicted of child neglect to complete a series of intensive, court-mandated parenting classes. This approach represents a profound shift in perspective, viewing the justice system not as a purely punitive institution but as an interventionist one. The goal is to break the generational cycle of neglect by equipping parents with the tools they never had. These are not simple lectures. They are often rigorous courses that cover a vast range of essential skills, from basic infant CPR and child nutrition to understanding developmental milestones and implementing positive discipline techniques that avoid violence. Parents learn how to create a structured, safe home environment, manage their own stress and anger, and access community resources for food, healthcare, and childcare support. The sentence is an admission that simply wanting to be a good parent is not enough. One must be taught how. The effectiveness of this rehabilitative model compared to incarceration is stark. Jailing a neglectful parent costs the state tens of thousands of dollars per year and frequently leads to worse outcomes. The parent loses their job, housing, and any semblance of stability, making reunification with their children even more difficult upon release. They return to the same environment with the same lack of skills, often leading to recidivism. Parenting classes, by contrast, are a targeted investment in human capital. They aim to address the root cause of the crime by building competence and confidence, empowering parents to actually care for their children properly. The success is measured not in time served but in reunified families, improved home environments, and most importantly, children who are safer, healthier, and able to thrive with their own families. It is a sentence that understands that for some crimes, the most powerful form of justice is not to punish a broken family, but to actively, compassionately, and intelligently work to fix it. This ingenious approach to sentencing brings us to a case where the justice system traded a cell block for a production studio, transforming an offender into an accidental advocate. The defendant was a man convicted of drunk driving, a crime tragically common yet perpetually devastating in its potential consequences. He had made the reckless decision to get behind the wheel while intoxicated, a choice that put countless lives at risk and demonstrated a profound failure of judgment. Rather than imposing a standard sentence of license suspension and a brief jail term, punishments this individual might have viewed as a mere inconvenient cost of doing business, the presiding judge issued a far more creative and impactful mandate. The man was ordered to write, produce, and fully fund a series of public service announcements aimed at his own community, each one explicitly detailing the dire dangers and potential lifelong repercussions of driving under the influence. This sentence operates on several powerful levels of restorative and deterrent justice. First, it forces a deep and uncomfortable level of personal engagement with the crime. The offender isn't just passively serving time, he is actively required to research the grim statistics of DUI fatalities, to understand the physics of impaired reaction times, and to confront the heart-wrenching stories of families torn apart by accidents just like the one he could have caused. To create a compelling and authentic PSA, he must internalize this information and then articulate it back to the public, a process that inevitably makes him the messenger of a warning against his own past behavior. This is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy administered by the court, designed to shatter any lingering denial or minimization he might cling to by making him an authority on the very behavior he exhibited. Furthermore, the financial component of the sentence being forced to personally fund the production and airtime for these advertisements ensures the punishment is felt meaningfully. The cost of producing a professional-grade video campaign and purchasing television or radio slots is substantial, often far exceeding a typical fine. This transforms the financial penalty from an abstract payment to the state into a direct investment in public safety, ensuring his money actively works to prevent others from making his same mistake. The community, which was put at risk by his actions, now receives a tangible benefit, a sustained, professionally crafted prevention campaign paid for by the offender himself. Perhaps most importantly, this strategy leverages a powerful psychological principle known as the saying is believing effect. When a person is compelled to publicly argue against a position they once held or an action they once took, it creates a powerful internal pressure to align their own beliefs with their words to reduce cognitive dissonance. By repeatedly stating, writing, and filming messages about the dangers of drunk driving, the offender is essentially persuading himself. He becomes his own best rehabilitator, using the act of creating a deterrent for others to solidify his own commitment to never commit the crime again. This sentence brilliantly turns the offender's time, money, and voice into instruments of prevention, hoping that by making him warn others, the court can ensure he never again needs a warning himself. While the previous sentences involved creative mandates for action, some of the most subtly powerful restrictions involve judicial orders to completely sever a connection, a sentence that carves a person out of your life by court order. We venture now into the strange and deeply personal territory of a probation condition known as a no-contact order, but with a peculiar twist. This isn't the standard order to stay away from a victim or a co-defendant. This is a sentence where a judge prohibits an offender from having any contact with specific individuals who are not involved in the crime whatsoever. Imagine being told you can no longer speak to your lifelong best friend, your cousin, or a romantic partner because the court has deemed that person a bad influence, a gateway back to your old life. This extraordinary exercise of judicial power raises profound questions about the limits of the state's authority to restructure our most personal relationships in the name of rehabilitation. The legal authority for such a broad order stems from the vast discretion judges are granted to set reasonable conditions of probation. The overarching goal of probation is rehabilitation and protecting public safety, and courts have consistently ruled that judges can impose any condition that is reasonably related to that goal. If a judge, after hearing the facts of a case and the defendant's history, genuinely believes that a specific individual is a direct trigger for criminal behavior, they can legally forbid contact. For example, a judge might learn that every time the defendant spends time with a particular old friend, they end up getting drunk and getting into fights, or that a specific cousin is their sole connection to a drug-dealing network. The judge's reasoning is pragmatic. To break the cycle of crime, you must sometimes break the cycle of association. It's a preemptive strike, building a moat around the defendant's reformed life by removing a perceived Trojan horse that could sneak temptation back inside. However, this well-intentioned power plunges us into a thicket of ethical and practical dilemmas. On one hand, it can be a brilliantly effective tool. For a young person trying to escape gang life, an order to cut ties with former associates is not just reasonable, it's potentially life-saving. For a recovering addict, being legally barred from seeing their using partner creates a powerful external barrier that supports their own fragile willpower. The court order provides a legitimate excuse to say, "I can't, my probation officer will send me to jail," deflecting peer pressure and creating unnecessary distance for a new identity to form. In these cases, the sentence acts as a protective fence, built by the state to guard a person's rehabilitation until they are strong enough to guard it themselves. On the other hand, this power risks a massive overreach into the fundamental right to free association, a right implied by the First Amendment. Critics argue that while a judge can certainly discourage certain friendships, issuing a legally binding order that severs personal relationships is a step too far. It forces the defendant to choose between their freedom and their friendships, a cruel and potentially counterproductive ultimatum. Furthermore, the order places an enormous burden on the other, entirely innocent person who is suddenly legally forbidden from contacting someone they care about, without ever having been charged with a crime themselves or given a chance to defend their character in court. They become a non-person in the defendant's life by judicial fiat. The practical enforcement is also a nightmare. How does a probation officer truly monitor every text message, every secret meeting, or every coded interaction? This type of sentence ultimately relies on a deep and perhaps naive trust in the power of a piece of paper to surgically remove one thread from the complex, messy web of human connection, demonstrating the justice system's struggle to balance its duty to protect with its duty to respect the private lives it seeks to reform. This innovative approach to justice, which seeks to heal rather than just incarcerate, found a powerful and colorful expression in a case where a courtroom exchanged a set of jail cell keys for a set of paintbrushes. The defendant was a graffiti artist, but not the kind whose work is celebrated in urban art galleries. This was a pure vandal, someone who had defaced public and private property with tags and crude designs, treating the city itself as a personal canvas without permission. His crimes were a persistent nuisance, costing business owners and the city thousands of dollars in cleanup fees. When he finally stood before the judge, the court was presented with a familiar pattern. A young person with clear artistic energy, but a complete lack of constructive outlets or respect for community spaces. Instead of a standard sentence of fines his family might pay or a stint on a road crew picking up trash, the judge issued a ruling that was as creative as the defendant's own impulses. The vandal was ordered to create a large-scale, legitimate piece of public art, a mural, on a wall that had been designated by the city, transforming his sentence from one of passive punishment into active, productive rehabilitation. This sentence operates on multiple levels of psychological and social insight, beginning with the concept of channeling negative energy into a positive force. The judge recognized that the defendant's actions stemmed from a drive to create and be seen, however misapplied. Simply locking him up would do nothing to address that underlying drive. It would merely suppress it temporarily, likely leading to the same behavior upon release. By mandating the creation of a mural, the court was effectively prescribing a form of artistic occupational therapy. The sentence forced the vandal to take the same skills he used illegally, his understanding of color, composition, and scale, and apply them lawfully under supervision and for the benefit of the community he had previously defaced. This process required discipline, planning, and collaboration with city officials, teaching him that real art involves not just talent, but also permission, respect, and a dialogue with the space it occupies. The public display component of the sentence was its true masterstroke. This wasn't art created in a private studio, it was art as public service, as a permanent, visible part of his probation. The finished mural would stand in the community as a daily, undeniable testament to his court-ordered restitution. For the vandal, this transformed his punishment into a legacy. Every time he or anyone else passed the mural, they would see not a tag of defiance, but a work of contribution. This could powerfully reshape his own self-image from someone who takes from the community into someone who gives to it. For the victims of his previous crimes and the public at large, the mural served as a unique form of restorative justice. Instead of just removing the eyesore of his graffiti, the community gained a beautiful new piece of art. The sentence repaired the harm by adding something of value rather than just subtracting the offender from society. It demonstrated that the justice system could be a patron of the arts as well as a punisher of crime, using creativity itself as the catalyst for reform and proving that sometimes the most effective sentence isn't a sentence at all, but a mandate to build something beautiful where once there was only damage. While the mural sentence channeled artistic energy and the DUIPS mandate weaponized personal testimony, another approach targets the very intellect that white-collar criminals so often misuse, sentencing them not to confinement but to a classroom. In a fascinating twist on rehabilitation, judges presiding over cases of financial fraud have begun to issue a sentence that seems almost too logical. They order convicted white-collar criminals to complete comprehensive courses in financial literacy and professional ethics. This isn't a suggestion for self-improvement. It's a court-mandated educational program, a forced return to school designed to address the specific cognitive and moral deficits that enabled the criminal behavior in the first place. The psychological rationale behind this sentence is a masterclass in targeted intervention. A typical fraudster isn't an uneducated person who stumbled into crime. They are often highly intelligent individuals who possess a sophisticated understanding of financial systems. Their crime isn't a failure of knowledge, but a failure of ethics, a deliberate decision to use their expertise to exploit loopholes, deceive investors, and manipulate markets for personal gain. A standard prison sentence punishes the action but does little to correct the underlying justification that allowed it. The financial literacy and ethics course, however, attacks the problem at its root. It forces the offender to sit through hours of instruction on the very principles they violated, creating a sustained, unavoidable confrontation with the moral framework they chose to ignore. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy on a grand scale, systematically dismantling the complex web of rationalizations. Everyone does it. The system is rigged anyway. They were greedy and deserved it. That allowed them to commit their crimes with a clear conscience. This sentence also operates on a powerful level of ironic justice. By ordering a successful financier or business executive to attend a basic financial ethics class, the judge is effectively demoting them. They are placed in a room, perhaps with other offenders or even with students, and are forced to listen to an instructor explain concepts like fiduciary duty, transparency, and honesty as if they were beginners. This experience is deliberately humbling, designed to shatter the aura of superiority and invincibility that often surrounds white-collar criminals. For someone who viewed themselves as a master of the financial universe, being treated like a novice who needs remedial lessons in right and wrong can be a more profound punishment than a short stay in a low-security prison. It attacks their ego and professional identity, forcing a reevaluation of what it truly means to be smart or successful in business. Beyond the punishment, however, lies a genuine attempt at measurable rehabilitation. The goal is to send the offender back into the business world not just chastised but fundamentally reformed. The courses are often rigorous, requiring exams and detailed projects that demonstrate a newfound understanding of ethical decision-making. Proponents argue that this creates a much stronger safeguard against recidivism than simple deterrence. Instead of just fearing punishment, the offender is, in theory, equipped with a stronger moral compass and a clearer understanding of the long-term consequences of unethical behavior, not just for their victims but for the market as a whole. This educational sentencing represents the justice system at its most pragmatic and optimistic, asserting that even for the most calculated crimes, the best cure might not be a longer sentence but a better education. Imagine a sentence where the punishment doesn't feel like punishment at all, but rather a strange and beautiful form of public atonement. This brings us to the case of a talented but troubled musician who found himself on the wrong side of the law after a series of non-violent offenses, perhaps driven by addiction or simple bad luck. The judge, learning of the man's musical abilities, saw an opportunity far more creative than a standard fine or a brief jail term. The ruling was as unconventional as it was humane. The musician was ordered to perform his community service not by picking up trash on the highway, but by taking his instrument into local nursing homes and hospitals to play for the residents and patients. This wasn't just service, it was sentenced serenading, a directive to use his gift not for personal gain or self-destruction, but as a balm for those who needed it most. This approach represents a pinnacle of rehabilitative thinking, where the court acts not just as a punisher but as a perceptive director, expertly casting the defendant in a role that transforms their weakness into a community's strength. The genius lies in the perfect matching of the sentence to the defendant's unique talents and skills. For a construction worker, meaningful service might involve rebuilding a community center. For a graphic designer, it could be creating posters for a local nonprofit, but for a musician, the most valuable asset they can offer is their art. The judge recognized that forcing this man to perform would achieve several profound goals simultaneously. First, it provides genuinely valuable and uplifting service to some of the most isolated and vulnerable members of the community, offering them comfort, distraction from pain, and a moment of joy. A form of restitution that is emotional and spiritual rather than merely financial. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly for the offender, this sentence is designed to rebuild his own damaged self-worth and reconnect him to society through a positive channel. Playing in a sterile, clinical room for an audience of strangers in wheelchairs or hospital beds is a far cry from the ego-driven environment of a nightclub or bar. It is a humbling yet empowering experience, the immediate and raw gratitude from the listeners, a smile from someone who hasn't spoken in weeks, a tearful thank you from a family member in the hallway, provides a type of feedback that is utterly foreign to the justice system. This positive reinforcement can be a powerful catalyst for change, showing the musician that his talent holds a value he may have never considered, that he is capable of creating good in the world rather than just chaos. The court, in its wisdom, uses the performance as a vehicle to deliver a lesson in empathy, forcing the defendant to confront his own humanity by bringing solace to others. It's a sentence that understands the best way to repair a broken individual is sometimes to put them in a situation where they have no choice but to help repair someone else, using the very skill they thought was just for themselves. But what happens when the crime itself is digital and the tool of the offense is as fundamental to modern life as a pen or a telephone? This brings us to one of the most conceptually fascinating and practically challenging sentences on our list, the case of a convicted hacker who was not simply sent to prison, but was instead prohibited from using any computers or accessing the internet for a period of several years. Imagine, in the 21st century, being ordered to live as if it were 1985. This sentence attempts to fight digital fire with a digital drought, severing the offender from the very environment that enabled their criminal behavior. For a hacker whose identity, skills, and social world are often deeply enmeshed with technology, this is not a minor inconvenience, it is a form of professional and social exile. The court's intention is clear and arguably brilliant: to enact a form of targeted incapacitation. By removing the instrument of the crime, the sentence aims to create a forced cooling-off period, a technological detox designed to break addictive patterns of behavior and allow for genuine rehabilitation away from the constant temptations and triggers of the online world. It's a punishment tailored with surgical precision, aiming to protect the public by digitally disarming the offender. However, the enforcement of such a sweeping technology ban presents a logistical and ethical minefield that highlights the immense difficulty of applying 20th century legal concepts to 21st century life. How does a probation officer possibly monitor such a prohibition? The internet is no longer just a desktop computer in a den. It is woven into the fabric of daily existence. It's in our pockets on smartphones, on our wrists with smartwatches, on our televisions, in our cars, and even in our kitchen appliances. Is the offender barred from using an ATM, which is essentially a computer terminal? Can they not use a modern checkout line at a grocery store? The sentence risks creating a person who is functionally unable to participate in society, making it nearly impossible to secure or maintain employment, access government services, or even engage in basic civic duties. This level of restriction can feel less like rehabilitation and more like a life sentence of technological illiteracy and social isolation, potentially doing more damage to the offender's prospects for a normal life than a finite period of incarceration would. This leads us to the critical question of effectiveness and the ultimate goal of the justice system. Proponents argue that for a cybercriminal, a technology ban is the only punishment that truly fits the crime, a necessary and proportional response that directly addresses the root of the problem. They contend that prison often fails to rehabilitate hackers, who might even hone their skills behind bars, whereas a forced hiatus from the digital world can demystify its allure, break compulsive habits, and provide the mental space for the offender to develop new interests and a healthier identity. Critics, however, see it as a well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive measure. They argue that instead of fostering rehabilitation, a broad technology ban effectively prevents it. In a world where digital literacy is a prerequisite for most employment, such a sentence ensures the offender will be unemployable in any legitimate tech-adjacent field upon release, dramatically increasing the likelihood they will return to the only trade they know: illegal hacking. A more modern and nuanced approach might involve heavily monitored and restricted access, allowing for the development of legitimate skills through certified educational programs while using sophisticated monitoring software to block any unauthorized activity. This case forces us to confront a profound dilemma. In an attempt to protect the digital world from a criminal, does the justice system risk creating an exile from the modern world altogether? And in doing so, might it be planting the seeds for a more desperate and skilled criminal to emerge once the sentence is finally over? This particular case from the early 1980s involved a man named Dennis Gene Anderson, a bank robber whose chosen method of disguise during his crimes was to wear a wig, makeup, and women's clothing to conceal his identity. When he was finally apprehended and stood before a federal judge, the court was presented with a unique offender and a perplexing situation. The judge, perhaps struggling to understand the motivation behind the crimes or seeking to address what he perceived as an underlying cause for the criminal behavior, handed down a sentence that extended far beyond simple prison time. As a specific condition of his probation, Dennis Anderson was ordered to undergo psychological counseling explicitly targeted at stopping his cross-dressing, effectively prohibiting this form of gender expression for the duration of his court supervision. On its surface, the mandate for psychological treatment could be interpreted as a well-intentioned, albeit clumsy, attempt at rehabilitative justice. The judge might have reasoned that the cross-dressing was a symptom of a deeper psychological distress that was somehow driving the defendant to commit robberies, and that treating this perceived distress was the key to preventing future criminal acts. However, the specific targeting of his cross-dressing behavior as the focus of court-ordered therapy is where the sentence plunges into deeply problematic and ethically murky territory. The ruling effectively pathologized his choice of disguise, legally equating it with the criminal act itself, and implicitly stating that his gender expression was a disorder in need of state-sanctioned correction. This judicial approach is now widely criticized for its fundamental conflation of a personal identity issue with a separate, unlawful action. Anderson's criminal intent was to steal money. His choice of clothing was merely the method he employed to achieve that goal, much like another robber might use a mask or a stolen car. By ordering therapy aimed at curing his cross-dressing, the court ventured far beyond its purview, suggesting that the way he expressed his gender was inherently linked to his criminality. This reflects a historical and outdated worldview that has often unfairly associated queer and gender nonconforming identities with deviance, mental illness, and a propensity for unlawful behavior. A more contemporary and ethical legal approach would have been to mandate psychological counseling focused on the actual underlying issues that lead to criminal behavior, such as problems with impulse control, financial desperation, or a willingness to use violence, while leaving his personal expression entirely out of the court's concern. The legal and ethical issues here are profound, touching upon the First Amendment's protections of expression and the 14th Amendment's guarantees of liberty and equal protection. The sentence imposed a government-compelled identity, demanding that Anderson conform to the judge's personal and societal standards of normal gender presentation as a condition for keeping his freedom. It raises the disturbing question of how far the state can go in regulating a citizen's personal life under the guise of rehabilitation. This strange and controversial sentence stands as a stark reminder of how the justice system can sometimes overstep, attempting to fix aspects of a person's life that are not broken, simply because they fall outside a particular individual's understanding of normalcy. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal bias to dictate legal outcomes, especially when those outcomes involve the complex and deeply personal realm of identity. Our final stop on this tour of the strange brings us to a sentence that feels less like a punishment and more like a social experiment in radical empathy. Imagine a defendant standing before a judge, not for a violent crime, but for a pattern of persistent, low-level offenses that suggested a profound disconnection from the community, perhaps petty theft, vandalism, or chronic disorderly conduct. The judge in this case saw that traditional fines or short jail stays were merely temporary setbacks, not transformative experiences. The sentence handed down was one of pure conditional suspension. All jail time would be suspended, but not in exchange for simple probation. Instead, the defendant's freedom was made entirely contingent upon their performance of a long list of documented acts of kindness and community service, each one requiring proof and a detailed report to be submitted directly to the court for review. This approach is a masterful application of behavioral psychology, specifically the principles of operant conditioning and cognitive dissonance theory. The judge is essentially engineering a new reality for the offender, using the powerful motivator of freedom to reinforce prosocial behavior. Operant conditioning works on a system of rewards and punishments. Here, the reward of avoiding jail is directly tied to the performance of positive actions. Every time the defendant helps an elderly neighbor with groceries, volunteers at a soup kitchen, or picks up trash in a public park, they are not just completing a task, they are actively earning their liberty. This creates a powerful positive feedback loop where good behavior is tangibly linked to a desired outcome, systematically training the brain to associate altruism with personal benefit. But the deeper, more transformative mechanism at play is likely cognitive dissonance. This psychological theory suggests that people feel mental discomfort when their actions do not align with their self-perception. Initially, this defendant likely saw themselves as an outsider, a rebel, or someone who takes what they need without regard for others. However, the court is forcing them to consistently perform actions that are completely at odds with that self-image to be helpful, generous, and community-minded. To resolve the intense discomfort of this contradiction, their psyche has only one logical path. They must begin to change their internal self-narrative. They can't rationalize spending every weekend volunteering at an animal shelter while still thinking of themselves as a selfish person. To reduce the dissonance, they are psychologically compelled to adopt a new identity. I am the kind of person who helps others. The sentence cleverly uses action to reprogram belief, betting that by forcing the behavior of a good citizen, the court can ultimately create the mindset of one. Beyond the psychological reprogramming of the individual, this sentence serves a profound restorative purpose for the community itself. Unlike a jail term, which only subtracts a problematic person for a short while, this mandate actively adds value. The community receives thousands of hours of unpaid labor directed at its most pressing needs, from cleaned-up parks to assisted seniors. The harm caused by the individual's past actions is actively repaired not through abstract punishment, but through direct, measurable good works. This transforms the justice system from a purely punitive institution into an engine for community betterment, turning a net drain on societal resources into a net positive. It represents a truly creative frontier in sentencing, one that dares to ask a profound question. What if the goal of justice isn't just to make people pay for their crimes, but to actively help them become better people, and in doing so, make the world around them a slightly better place for everyone? From court-ordered cinema therapy to sentences demanding Shakespearean analysis, from the humbling spectacle of a highway billboard confession to the profound isolation of a cross-country walk of atonement, our journey through American courtrooms has revealed a justice system capable of astonishing creativity and profound controversy. We've witnessed judges who wield their gavels not just as instruments of punishment, but as tools for psychological intervention, ordering offenders to muck out the stables they vandalized, to adopt vegetarianism after poaching, or to perform community service with the very musical talent they once misused. These are not sentences conceived in idle whimsy. They are deliberate, often desperate, attempts to break cycles of behavior that traditional fines and jail time have failed to correct. They represent a judicial hunger for something more meaningful than simple retribution, a reach toward a justice that repairs, educates, and truly transforms. The broader implications of this trend in alternative sentencing force us to confront fundamental questions about the very purpose of our legal system. On one hand, these creative sentences can be seen as a laudable evolution beyond the brute force of incarceration. They often provide direct, tangible restitution to victims and communities, a mural painted over graffiti, a public apology ad paid for by a fraudster, weekend labor maintaining a desecrated cemetery. They aim for rehabilitation through immersive experience, whether it's forcing a drunk driver to confront the grim statistics while producing a PSR or compelling a young offender to learn accountability through the demanding routine of a fast food job. This approach is pragmatically appealing, often cheaper than imprisonment, and laser-focused on addressing the root cause of the crime itself, not just its symptoms. Yet the shadow of judicial eccentricity and potential overreach looms large. Where is the line between innovative rehabilitation and cruel, unusual, or simply bizarre punishment? Is it truly the state's role to mandate church attendance, enforce a vegetarian diet, or psychoanalyze an attempt to cure a defendant's cross-dressing? These sentences, however well-intentioned, risk veering into territory that violates personal freedoms and constitutional protections, imposing a judge's personal values under the cloak of legal authority. The effectiveness of these methods is also notoriously difficult to measure. Does a month of watching Groundhog Day truly inspire lasting change, or does it simply become a quirky anecdote? The potential for wildly inconsistent application of justice from one courtroom to the next creates a system where the outcome of a case can depend less on the facts and more on the particular philosophy of the judge on the bench that day. So, does this represent progress or merely peculiarity? The answer is likely as complex as the human behavior the system tries to mend. For some offenders, a creatively tailored sentence that demands introspection and direct amends may indeed offer a more powerful path to redemption than a passive period behind bars. For others, these unusual mandates may be ineffective, humiliating, or even counterproductive. The true measure of these sentences may not be in their novelty, but in their empathy and their proportionality. Do they demonstrate a genuine understanding of the individual before the court, and do they fit the crime in a way that feels both just and purposeful? The American experiment in justice continues to evolve, and these strange sentences are a testament to that ongoing struggle, a constant, often awkward, search for a system that can punish the act while still believing in the potential of the person. We want to hear your verdict on this. Where should the line be drawn between creative justice and judicial overreach? Share your most surprising thoughts and personal perspectives on these unusual punishments in the comments below.